Yes.
Okay, that's all right. Right, assalamu alaikum everybody. So tonight I'm basically going to be looking at modern philosophy of religion and recent progress that's been made in the past couple of decades. I think it's interesting to look at the developments that have been made in this particular field, as well as the arguments that have been going on amongst contemporary philosophers. And moreover, I think it's important to consider the implications particularly for Islamic theism and Islamic theology. And I think that typically with Islamic theologians, they tend to go for sort of the more easy, the atheistic and naturalistic sort of arguments. But I think there's very powerful, sophisticated case to be heard from the other side that's sort of being neglected. So part of the goal of my talk here is to sort of illuminate that a little bit more. So that's all my introduction. I'm going to speak about how to think about the two main worldviews, so theism and naturalism, and what they mean. And I'm going to present some of the strongest arguments which I think have been presented in favour of naturalism, and then maybe in the discussion we can talk about what that all means for the rest of us. So yeah, just as an introductory, the first point I'm going to challenge is what I like to call the winner-takes-all, or winner-takes-all approach to the existence of God. A lot of people seem to think that if theism is true, then all the evidence must somehow support God. Or if atheism is true, then all evidence must support the non-existence of God. But I think this is mistaken. If theism is true, there can be some evidence for atheism, and if atheism is true, there can be some evidence for theism. The more interesting question is, though, where on balance does the evidence fall? So, and obviously, as people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, they see religion as an irrational position, product of irrational thinking. I think this is obviously mistaken. Many theists, unfortunately, see atheism as a product of irrational thinking. This is also mistaken. Many people see philosophy of religion as a waste of time. Well, next 20 minutes you'll be the judge of that. Alright, so in these sorts of discussions, we're always confronted with the problem of evidence. So what is evidence? People often say, there is no evidence for God, or, there is evidence for God. What do these people actually mean? I think an analogy here would be helpful. So Paul Draper came up with the analogy of two jars full of blue jelly beans. And he basically said, imagine that one jar has a majority of blue jelly beans, while the other has a majority of red jelly beans. If I handed you a blue jelly bean, it could have come from the first jar, because there is some blue jelly beans in there, but most likely it came from the second jar, because the second jar is predominantly blue jelly beans. Conversely, with red, most probably it came from jar one, even though there are some red jelly beans in jar two. This is an analogy for two worldviews, naturalism and theism. Naturalism says that the natural world is all there is, that the natural world is a closed system, that the physical ultimately explains the mental. Theism, on the other hand, claims that that the mental explains why anything physical at all exists, that there is at least one supernatural agent, and that agent has certain creative dispositions. So these two worldviews currently are the two competing worldviews for an ultimate explanation of ultimate reality. And they're virtually symmetric. There could be other worldviews, but in terms of modesty and coherence, these are the two main contenders. This is just a formula I thought I'd put up. It's called Bayes' theorem. So Bayes' theorem says that if we have a particular hypothesis, to evaluate the probability of the hypothesis being true, we need to look at two things. We need to look at, firstly, its prior probability. So before even looking at the evidence, what's the modesty of that claim, what's the coherence of that claim? And secondly, we have to look at the explanatory power. So when you multiply the explanatory power by the prior probability, you get the probability that that hypothesis is true given the evidence. So part of my case today is arguing that the probability of naturalism given some certain evidence is greater than 0.5. So my first contention is naturalism has a higher prior probability than compared to theism. When you look at the two worldviews, naturalism just says that the natural world exists, and we all agree, whether or not you're a naturalist, that natural world clearly exists. However, theism says that yes, the natural world exists, but it adds on more claims. It says that the natural world exists, but in addition to that, there's a supernatural agent that made the natural world. We can go even more specific than this. There's personal supernaturalism that says that there's a being that's specifically interested in the interests of human beings. And you can go even more specific into Islamic theism, which is a particular version of personal supernaturalism, which says that, obviously, revelation was handed down to the Prophet Muhammad, and etc. We know the rest. So that was my first contention, that naturalism has a much higher prior probability than theism, because I'll just go back, because since naturalism makes less claims, it has less ways to be wrong compared to theism, whereas theism, especially Islamic or Christian theism, makes such specific claims that the probability is especially low when you compare it to naturalism. So that's my first contention. My second contention is that naturalism has a greater explanatory power. My first observation is the fact that consciousness is dependent on the physical brain. And it's quite evident, from brain damage or stimulating the brain, that your memories, your mental states are all dependent on physical arrangements of matter in your brain. So when we stimulate your brain, we can cause an experience to happen. Certain brain damage can cause your mental states to disappear. Obviously, development and the complexity of the brain are highly correlated. All of this is expected on naturalism, because on naturalism, the only way to get consciousness is through arrangements of matter. Whereas on theism, God doesn't have a body, God doesn't have a brain. God, from the beginning, we're assuming that God is like a disembodied mind. He doesn't require a brain. So on theism, we would expect, if there is to exist conscious beings, that they don't need a physical substrate in order for them to have consciousness. So that's some evidence for naturalism. And it also conflicts with other ideas, for example, about the soul being the seat of consciousness. But my second point is biological evolution. So evolution, as it stands, is a scientific fact, and the evidence for it is overwhelming. So how does this relate to theism and naturalism? Well, if naturalism is true, and we have complex living things coming into existence on naturalism, the only way for that to happen is through biological evolution. Certainly, God has other options to create life than just evolution. God could have created through evolution, but God could have created through special creation. God could have created creatures individually. God could have used evolution for certain species and not others. So clearly, God has many other options than just evolution. So clearly, if naturalism is true, then evolution has to be true. So the fact that evolution is pretty much a fact is strong evidence for naturalism, because on theism, God has many other options to create life, not just evolution. So it's quite a coincidence that God would use the very same mechanism that naturalism used to create life. Okay, so this is a related argument. This is Professor Paul Draper from Purdue University. He was famous for his 1989 article, Pain and Pleasure, an Evidential Problem for Theists. He basically argued that there are certain considerations about pain and pleasure that are more likely on the assumption that naturalism is true. So how did he do this? So this was his strategy. He basically said, so there are certain observations about pain and pleasure, most of which appear morally random. So think about it this way. On theism, God of course is a moral agent, is a moral being, and he would have a morally sufficient reason for allowing certain forms of pain and pleasure to exist. Whereas on naturalism, pain and pleasure are not moral, are not tools of moral utility. Pain and pleasure are biological mechanisms which are linked with reproductive success. So when we look at nature, we see, for example, instances of pain which don't contribute at all to biological success or reproduction, or pleasure. Conversely, pleasure doesn't contribute to biological success or reproduction. That's entirely expected on naturalism, because evolution is an imperfect process and it's indifferent to human beings. But on theism, God could fine-tune our nervous systems to ensure that we only feel pain or pleasure only when it's morally necessary or biologically necessary. When you consider, for example, Ebola patients who literally bleed to death from exsanguination, that form of pain is not biologically useful. So it's, in that sense, it's biologically gratuitous, and we would expect that form of pain on naturalism. And of course, we don't have much. I want to leave more time for discussion, but those are some of the explanations that Draper responds to. So basically, so that was basically Draper's argument. And some responses to his argument would be that pain encourages people to perform morally good acts without compromising freedom. And that again assumes some sort of libertarian free will. I'm going to get into that later. Second challenge to his argument is that pain allows us to appreciate the moral weight that attaches to our moral decisions. However, this only explains moral pain. It doesn't explain non-moral pain that's not related to our individual free will or actions. And the third challenge is called skeptical theism. This has become a popular view in philosophy of religion. It says that, look, even though there's evil in the world, God could have a morally sufficient reason for allowing it to happen. So I'm going to challenge that as well. My next argument is John Schellenberg's argument from divine hiddenness. This is his 1993 book, Divine Hiddenness and Human Reason. In this book, he basically presented one of the newest arguments against the existence of God and for naturalism. So, what Schellenberg said was, look, when you look at the world, there are certain people who are non-believers, but they are what he calls non-resistant non-believers, or reasonable non-believers. There are people out there who don't believe in God, who don't accept theism, but are not only open to theism, but also non-resistant to the idea of God, and people who are lifelong seekers in God, and somehow they can't form that relationship. So if theism is true, we would expect anybody who is able to form that relationship with God would be able to form that relationship. So why is it that when we look at the world, we have so many people who are not only non-believers, but non-resistant, reasonable non-believers, people who can actually justify their non-belief. And they're not in a state of resistance to God. They're actually many of them are quite open to the existence of God. This is interesting because when you look at it from a cultural perspective, especially from a Muslim sort of discourse, a lot of people who see non-believers as a product of irrationality or rebelling against God or wanting to commit sin, this sort of argument challenges that, because even if the majority of atheists are somehow irrational and want to resist God and want God not to exist, even if in all of human history there was at least one person who was a non-resistant non-believer, this is still evidence against theism and evidence for naturalism, because it's quite surprising. And it doesn't end there. There's further evidence, further facts about non-resistant non-belief that is evidence for naturalism. The fact that when you look at religious belief and how it's distributed amongst the world, there's a strong correlation between political, social factors. The fact, as I said, there's lifelong seekers of religion. They just can't be convinced to follow that religious path. They don't find the reasons compelling. Another interesting thing I came across was biologically based on belief. So there's people who are born, for example, with autistic spectrum disorder, and they, for example, are what's called they're mind blind. They're completely, they have no knowledge of other minds apart from themselves, but they have a very special ability at systemizing information, pattern seeking. But their non-belief in most cases is biological in nature. So it's surprising on theism why God would create people who have this predisposition to not believe in Him, when the whole purpose of it is to seek God and find bliss in God. So there's religious confusion. Obviously, there's people who pursue radically from religious paths, and it's not clear that any of these particular religious paths bears any more moral fruit than any other religious path. There's moral handicaps, like psychopaths. Obviously, you can reduce that to neurochemistry. And there's also ethical disagreement about certain moral facts, even within religious traditions. So, that's also surprising. And obviously there's a standard problem of evil, the fact that there's triumphs and tragedy in the world. There's this interesting quote by Paul Draper I wanted to read regarding flourishing and languishing. So Paul Draper says, the majority of living things, including the majority of sentient beings, never flourish. A naturalistic Darwinian explanation of this sad fact is readily available. If populations of organisms increase geometrically, and this leads to competition for resources necessary to survive, then inevitably a large percentage of all living things will not survive long enough to thrive, and many more will barely survive and thus languish for almost all of their lives. So basically a Darwinian naturalistic world, this sort of outcome is expected. So my next argument for naturalism is determinism. So many of us, the most common sense notion of free will is to actually accept that free will is real. Most people think that they do have free will, that they have the sort of libertarian free will to sort of make decisions sort of independent of any prior factors or prior causes. I don't seem to think that's the case. I'm sort of a hard determinist. I think that the evidence against free will is, the traditional notion of free will is quite strong. I think this poses a very strong challenge for theism, especially when you consider that on theism, humans are moral agents. We will be held accountable for our actions. So this requires the existence of some sort of libertarian free will. And if libertarian free will doesn't exist, then that's very problematic for most traditional religions. And especially when you consider that free will is employed as a theodicy to explain moral evils. People ask, why is there so much evil in the world? Why does God allow evil? Well, it's so we can have free will. But what if we don't have free will? Then where does that reason go? Then that doesn't work anymore. So yeah, what if free will is an illusion, which we can probably discuss that, then that's extremely problematic. I'm not sure this is my last. Okay, so this is my last evidence for naturalism. I think this is my 7th or 8th argument. Cosmic hostility. So while a lot of people have advocated the universe is fine-tuned for life, certainly some parameters do appear fine-tuned for the existence of human life. That argument sort of commits the fallacy of understated evidence. It fails to take into account, when you look at the universe as a whole, the Earth obviously is one of the billions of planets, our galaxy is one of the billions of galaxies, each with 100 billion stars, and not only the scale of the universe, sure, God could have some reasons for making it like that, but the general fact that the majority of the universe is hostile to life, the majority of the universe is not friendly to life, the majority of the universe will kill life instantly. We're talking, cosmic rays, high to low temperature extremes. So this sort of cosmic hostility is expected on naturalism, because on naturalism, humans are clearly irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, and the universe is indifferent to our suffering. Whereas on theism, God could have made the laws of nature. God isn't restricted by the laws of nature. He could have made the laws of nature in a way that they were more bio-friendly, and make it sort of distinguishable from a naturalistic universe. It's quite surprising that the sort of universe we live in that was created by God sort of looks like the universe we would expect on naturalism, so it's quite a coincidence. So to conclude, I want to just briefly look at, so I've presented the evidence for naturalism, so without being too biased, let's look at some evidence that some people might offer for theism, for thinking that theism, overpowers naturalism in terms of explanations. So the first most common one is, beginning of the universe, Big Bang Theory, universe began to exist. I think this whole approach is just wrong. And the reason why is because it commits the fallacy of equivocation. Even if the universe had a finite past, this doesn't mean the universe came into existence. And even if the universe had a finite past, this isn't a real problem for naturalism, because on naturalism, the universe obviously has always existed, some form of physical reality has always existed. But that physical reality could either be infinite into the past, or it could be finite. Now, if it's finite, the theist will say that the first state of reality was God's causal act to create the universe. But on naturalism, the first state of reality was the first state of the universe. So this cosmological argument doesn't really decide between the two worldviews. Both the theist and the atheist could sort of have their position on this. Moreover, to say that the beginning of the universe needed a cause, that requires a commitment to a particular theory in the philosophy of time, known as the A theory of time. And so far, the majority of philosophers in the philosophy of time, philosophy of physics, don't accept the A theory. It's quite a controversial position. Most accept the B theory. And on that view, the universe is just a static, eternal, four-dimensional block. So then people ask, why is there something rather than nothing? I think this is also completely the wrong sort of question to ask. Because firstly, you're assuming two things. You're assuming that nothing is somehow the default state of reality. And why should we think that nothing is the default state? What if the default state is for something to actually exist? Then something doesn't need explanation. Secondly, it assumes that nothing is actually something that can be actualized in the real world. And that to me doesn't seem coherent. What does it mean to say that absolute nothingness can exist as an alternative to something? That doesn't make sense to me. Fine-tuning, 2 points. Well, certainly some parameters of the universe look fine-tuned. Some parameters which appeared fine-tuned, later we found naturalistic explanations of why they appeared fine-tuned. However, when you think about it, God, who's omnipotent, doesn't need fine-tuning. He can create life under any sort of conditions. And this sort of fine-tuning argument sort of assumes naturalism, because on theism, we are not purely physical entities. We are metaphysical, we're souls, where we have a non-physical component to us. But on naturalism, of course, on naturalism, you're going to need fine-tuning for the sorts of biological systems we are to come about. Whereas on theism, we don't need fine-tuning. God can create life under any conditions he wants, because he's omnipotent. He's not restricted by the laws of nature. Moral landscape, objective moral values. Well, on the one hand, it's not really clear to me how theism can sort of ground objective moral values. Certainly one can say that God commands X, but then again, where does the prior moral obligation to obey God's command come from? I haven't really heard an answer to that. And certainly there are many naturalistic theories where objective moral values can exist, so it's not really in favor. And theism. Religious experience, well, again, when you look at specific details of religious experience, the fact that most of the people who have religious experiences already have a prior belief in God, the fact that most victims of tragedy are rarely comforted by a religious experience, and the fact, as I said, that many people who have religious experiences go on to pursue radically different religious paths, none of which seems to bear any more significant moral fruit than the other. Design, well, again, that will be accounted through natural laws. Why are there laws of nature? You could ask. On naturalism, why should there be laws? Don't we need a lawgiver? Well, this again, well, it sort of depends what you mean by the laws of nature. So some philosophies take to view the laws of nature are not things in and of themselves. They're not principles that somehow sit on top of nature and sort of govern nature. A lot of philosophers, even myself, are what we call regularity theorists. We think the laws of nature are just regularities or recurring patterns in the universe. And we as humans sort of systemize those patterns to a mathematical framework. And you might ask, why are there regularities at all? Why, in the absence of theism, why would you expect any regularities? Why would you expect the universe to be rational, rationally intelligible? However, when you think about it more carefully, probabilistically, it would be more likely for the universe to exhibit order. Because when you think about it, when we say the universe is ordered or has regularities, we're saying the universe has uniformity. And when you think about it, what's more probable, to have uniformity or variety? Well, clearly uniformity. Because when we say there's variety in the world, we're saying that there's a cause of that variety. Whereas when we say there's uniformity in the world, there could be a cause of that uniformity, or maybe that uniformity is just a brute fact, and maybe there isn't a cause of it. So it's metaphysically possible for uniformity to be uncaused, but we recognize that variety has to have a cause. So it's more intrinsically, what Paul Draper calls intrinsically probable for there to be real uniformity compared to real variety. Therefore, it's not surprising to have laws of nature or naturalism, especially when those laws of nature exhibit things like symmetry principles. And the last point, consciousness and subjective experience. As I explained, I think consciousness is some evidence for theism. I think on naturalism it is surprising why at all there would be some sort of phenomenal experience. However, as I mentioned, physical dependence of the mind, I think, cancels that evidence out. And when you consider the fact that consciousness is not something that's directly given, it's something that's developed through a conceptual framework, all of that is purely compatible with sort of materialistic physicalist theory of the mind. So above all, if we look at our scorecard here, in terms of naturalism, it predicts a hostile universe. Theism would expect, maybe not a completely friendly universe, but a lot more friendly than the universe we see it today. So naturalism, sort of wins in that area. In terms of biology, as I said, naturalism predicts evolution, whereas on theism, God has a number of options. God didn't have to use evolution, but if naturalism is true, evolution pretty much has to be true. It's the only way to get us, basically. Pain and pleasure, as Paul Draper argued, naturalism, fundamentally biological role, morally random. With on theism, God should have justifying reason. The fact that most beings languish rather than flourish, the fact that the mind is dependent on the physical brain, the fact that there are non-resistant non-believers in the world, the fact that a lot of non-belief can be biologically based, and the fact that there's ethical disagreement. So on balance, I think when you look at the evidence as it stands, the evidence supports naturalism over theism. Thank you.
Stay there.
Thank you very much. What a lovely presentation. I have very few words to express how thankful I am that you came today.
Thank you.
And how surprised I am that he's in year 12. And he speaks like a PhD candidate.
I was trying to figure out what
I'm 17.
Really? Wow.
PhD candidates in natural philosophy.
He's a fan of naturalism.
Yeah, that's why he's going to be our best buddy now. Okay, so what I'll do before we go into discussion, I just want to quickly raise up what we will be covering next fortnight and see if people are happy with it. Next program, we want to talk about a neurobiological model for the levels of the nafs. What does this mean for neuroethics? So, I'll be presenting this one. See, we always talk about the nafs in a very spiritual way, right? So the nafs, nafs al-ammara bisu, nafs al-munhama, nafs al-radiyya, all the different levels of the soul, and one exceeds the other at a different ontological and epistemological level. So we want to try to provide a neurobiological model that explains this from a naturalistic perspective, not from this aesthetic abstract load of junk that we hear all too often. We can explain this through the brain, and I'm hoping that maybe we can discuss this next fortnight. Are people happy with this, or is there another suggestion that people prefer to talk about?
I'm happy.
Happy with it? Yeah? Galinta? Yeah? All for it. Okay. Alright, okay, so let's go on to tonight's discussion. Maybe I'll put up these slides, and we'll go over the slides. If there
Anybody just have any comments?
particular.
Anything
Yeah,
stand
are
out
there
to
any
you?
comments?
I'll tell you what I understood.
No, all right. Thank you.
There's more evidence that I'm guessing naturalism is that it's not God.
No, I
What
basically.
know about naturalism is that the world is created naturally. It's natural without the physical power.
Yeah, it's basically the view that the natural world is all there is, and that ultimate reality is just physical, and that natural world is a closed system.
So
That's it.
you concluded,
Mhm.
correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
that there's no evidence of God.
No. That was the complete opposite of what I said. So
Because I was getting lost.
no, I was actually challenging that assumption in my presentation. My presentation, if you look at the first slide, I attack the winner-takes-all approach to evidence about God. What you just said, that there is no evidence for God, or all the evidence supports God. I reject that approach. I think that whether or not like if you're a theist or if you're an atheist, you can, like if you're a theist, for example, you can accept that there is some evidence against God, but that evidence is very weak. That's why you still believe in God. If you're an atheist, you could believe that there is evidence for God, but that evidence to you is not as strong. That's why you remain an atheist. So I'm basically saying the way to resolve this is to use Bayes' theorem, which is what I put up, which says, and I basically compared. Now you can do the same thing as I did and sort of come to a different conclusion.
Oh, that meant nothing. I'm sorry, I slipped through that.
Yeah. No, basically, I'm asking two questions. What's the probability of this view being true without even looking at any evidence? Just looking at what this view claims. What's the content of it? And then secondly, we multiply that probability by its explanatory power. What can it explain compared to other worldviews? Ultimately, we're comparing the ratio of theism to naturalism. It's not simply, this proves conclusively that there is God, this proves conclusively there is no God. It's a probabilistic argument based on weighing probability. So that's like the modern sort of approach.
So you didn't conclude, your opinion of things.
Sure.
Not ours.
No, I'm basically saying that I think Islamic theologians need to confront these sorts of arguments. So I'm basically presenting the other side and showing you what the current state of thinking in this area is. And I think if you want to take it seriously, we have to confront things like divine hiddenness, biological role, pain and pleasure, all these different things. Whenever I go to a sermon or something, these things are never ever discussed. And I think that they should be, because they're very important.
That's right. Which reminds me, we need to, since we're a young university student and we have capable philosophers, we should start to prepare research journals on contemporary Islamic philosophy. We don't have that. We lack that completely. We have classical Islamic philosophy, but we don't have contemporary Islamic philosophy at all. We can start doing something like this. Now that we have the generation that can help us produce this, we should start at university in writing journal papers on contemporary issues like good and evil, free will. Neuroscience totally destroys free will now. So all these conceptions that have a lot to do with contemporary Islamic philosophy.
Sorry, I have a question. Thank you very much. You're a genius, and I really appreciate your presence. And we might disagree, at the end of the day, we can have a dialogue as human beings. Now, from what I understood, obviously, from your argument, that because you're basing it on a probabilistic, if you want, logic, what kind of, if you want, reason does this probabilistic argument is based on.
What do you mean, what kind of reason?
Like, for example, we have different kinds of reason today. We have instrumental reason. We have managerial reason. We have, for example, mechanistic reason.
Yeah.
In other words, you can talk about the abstract reason that only looks at things as they are. You know, and obviously,
I think it's sort of epistemic reasoning, if I'll give it a name. So it's sort of saying if we, so you know, we're all thrust into this world, you know, this confusing world, that we're basically trying to make sense. You know, which hypothesis does the best explaining, which theory fits the data best, essentially. And I'm saying that, you know, as Muslims, you know, as theists, as, you know, whatever your religious persuasion should be, that like you need to sort of take into consideration these different sorts of lines of evidence and how they fit into your worldview. Now, I'm not saying that the theist can't explain any of this stuff. Certainly the theist can explain why there is divine hiddenness. They can offer potential explanations for why we have physical minds. But those are all what philosophers call auxiliary hypotheses. An auxiliary hypothesis is just an extra sort of hypothesis you add to your core hypothesis. But you're not really allowed to do that, because then your theory can sort of explain everything and there's no real falsifiability. So you have to sort of demonstrate that that auxiliary hypothesis actually is probable on your worldview a priori. And like, I mean, if you're able to do that, then, you know, there's no problem. In my case, collapsed. But you know, I just thought this was an interesting sort of observation. And when you compare the two contents, and one is clearly saying more, one is clearly saying less. And if one says less and explains more, then, you know, wouldn't you agree that's something in favour of that sort of worldview? Yeah. And even if naturalism has a higher probability and theism starts off with a low probability, that doesn't mean that we can clear-cut say which one's right, which one's true. I mean, the evidence for this could well exceed that, and it could catch up. So again, it's just a ratio.
Yeah, I understand, but because you see, for example, today even sociologists are starting to discover, theoretically and scientifically, obviously, because sociology is a very much secular science, if you want, that there are actually layers in human reality. There are different layers in human reality, and because, you know, obviously traditional sociologists, with the exception of some of them, like Durkheim, for example, they were not capable of trying to depict or trying to sense a deeper level of social reality, for example. And they argue that religion, obviously, is a product of what they call hyper-spirituality today, which is emergent from the relations of individuals with each other in society, which is a transcendental relation, because they are always oriented towards something greater than themselves. So